Hello all. Welcome to this session, Challenge Accepted, Circular Solutions to Green Energy's Demands. I also want to welcome people online. It's good to see so many of you here, and let's go for a fruitful discussion around this important topic. I'm Peter from Nordic Innovation, and Nordic Innovation is the innovation arm of the Nordic Council of Ministers. We're based in Oslo, 15 people, and we're co-hosting this session with the Smart Prosperity Institute and the Material Efficiency Research Group. And we're doing this session in 2 rounds. One is for the challenge part, and the last one is for the strategic priorities section. So I just want to give over the word to Alan, who is the director with Materials Efficiency Research Group, and the word is yours.
Thanks, Peter, and welcome everyone. Thanks for breaking with the lunch and all the networking possibilities that are going on there. I've been in every World Circular Economy Forum since the beginning, with the exception of Rwanda, and this is the first time we've seen a serious deep dive into the question of mining and minerals. I think it's a welcome and necessary focus, and there are a number of sessions throughout, which I hope we'll see weave together some common themes. For this one, we're going to be focusing on how do we responsibly and securely maintain sources of the essential minerals needed for the green energy transition, the generation, the transmission, and the storage of green energy necessary, which it turns out is a very materials-intensive process with a wide variety of minerals necessary, and with a variety of challenges associated with those. Geopolitical challenges, we've got environmental and social challenges, there are political conflicts, and then there are a variety of market shifts. So there's many different factors that make our current supply or our future supply needs for these critical minerals not obvious and not easy without crossing planetary borders or boundaries, and without crossing into areas in which we're running into actual supply chain interruptions. Fortunately, we've got 6 excellent speakers, very diverse and distinct viewpoints from different parts of the world, different regions, different elements of the mineral supply chain and circularity, to help us get insights into what are the challenges that green energy producers and consumers, all of us, are facing in the reality of delivering on these minerals, both primary and secondary. And today we'll start with 3 folks who I'm really pleased and honored to have on the stage, and I've met them in very different places, but that's for cocktails. We'll talk about that later. To my immediate left here, we've got Ashley Morris. She's the CEO of Corio, and they're an Australian-based company that is doing a wide variety of enabling strategies for circularity across many sectors and geographies. Next to her, we have Anna Pobrezhna, who is the CEO of ClearHub, which is a sustainable resource and infrastructure development company. I met Anna in Riyadh just earlier this year, working on some really interesting and surprising work in moving sort of Middle Eastern and other nations very invested in the green energy supply. And last but not least, we've got Sari Taza, who is the senior specialist at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment in Finland, and she is leading or working with colleagues on strategic action plans for bioeconomy, circular economy, and climate action. So each of them is going to speak for about 7 minutes, just on, from their perspectives, what are the key challenges we're facing, and how are these necessary supply chains, or how are the supply chains going to be enabled to deliver on this question of responsible and secure minerals? So without further ado, Ashley.
Okay. Well, hi everyone. First of all, thank you so much for having me all the way from Australia, a long way down under. But by way of background, just to sort of set the scene about the work that I do, Corio is a specialist circular economy practice, and we really pride ourselves on taking the circular economy from theory to implementation, really pushing that action. Now, because the circular economy, as we all know, is systemic, it requires us to work across all key junctures of the global economy. But from our inception, we've worked from a very much a diverse set of clients, from BHP to L'Oreal, but our largest engagement actually has been in the mining and metals industry, working with some federal and state governments on their critical mineral strategy, but a lot of the time with the private entities, the largest miners in the world, BHP, Rio Tinto, and Anglo American, from commodities as diverse as well as vanadium to iron ore, which gives me a really good perspective of the shared opportunities and equally the challenges, and a lot of the commercial considerations that come into what does it take to get miners participating in a circular economy. Now, the demand for the green energy transition is unprecedented in what it will require in terms of metals and minerals. And we should take a pause and ask ourselves, is this traditional extract and transact model the best we can do? Now, from my perspective and my exposure to industry, it's not. What is better is metals as a service. Now, I have worked on metals as a service as a model for the past 2 years, and as an international leading expert on this particular topic, I thought, because it's often talked about but not really delved into, I wanted to spend some of my 7 minutes talking about what is a metals as a service model, because a lot of the time the questions are the same. Now, the first of those questions is, what is it and how does it work? Well, essentially, a metals as a service model is an innovative commercial model in which an entity doesn't need to be a miner, but I'll use a miner as the example for today. They maintain ownership of the metal instead of selling it. But importantly, they also direct the utility, the value of that metal, to its most valuable applications. And in this instance, it could very much be to support the green energy transition into renewable energy technologies. The next question we often get is like, what is the value of this model and how can it support that green energy transition? Well, important, and I love what the co-chair of the International Resources Panel shared this morning, Janez Potočnik, which is we need to move away from incentivizing the current practice, which is let's dig up as much stuff as we can as fast as possible and make as much profit to support growth. We really need to move away from this resource extraction mentality to resource stewardship. Now, if you retain ownership of those metals throughout supply chains, you are now a resource steward. You care about where the metal came from and where it's moving through the economy. And if you want to be contributing to a circular economy as an outcome, well, then you are going to be pushing it and directing this metal to its highest value application. And importantly, through doing that, if you know where it's coming from, where it's going, it can enable us to have traceability end to end and to optimize end to end. And we can link this to advances in technology, which was also discussed this morning in our main forum. Things like metal passports, which contain different ESG credentials. We can start to have greater transparency about the performance of how metals move through our value chains. Second, it can allow us to be strategic and systemic with how we consider where metals are coming from. They don't necessarily need to always come from a mine. They can come from our urban mine. They can also come from the residual waste that our patients touched on this morning. We can also think about where metals are most proximal to the value that they could create, thinking about regional ecosystems, regional hubs for processing, more decentralized than these large ways we process metals today. And lastly, to conclude my points on this particular model, it actually, through an entity maintaining the ownership of the metal, it reduces the capital expenditure. And if we're talking about our OEMs, our original equipment manufacturers, downstream in the supply chains, we need them to putting as much production on their production lines as possible, as fast as possible. Now, capital is a constraint. And so if we can reduce the capital expenditure so they have access, not ownership, that's really important. And if I tie in the social lens here, it matters where some of these materials come from because these metals create value often in perpetuity. These can be linked to sovereign wealth funds, and we can distribute some of that value amongst the the people of the nation, to make sure we're all getting an equal share of this value, because we have an equality crisis as well as a biodiversity and climate crisis. Thanks.
Thank you. It was a remarkably concise and summary of a very highly complex transformative strategy. But I think this is where we need to go, and it sort of reflects something that we've heard, and perhaps some in the audience have heard this phrase before. But it was Mark Cutifani, the previous CEO of Anglo American, who said that it is well past time that we move from being a mining company to a materials service provider, and that could be considered, convenient corporate rhetoric, but it's actually true. And in the model that you've described is the opportunity, the business opportunity, the full supply chain engagement opportunity that creates for shareholders, for stakeholders and others, an immense potential value and a service that we desperately need as a society. So thanks for that summary.
Welcome.
Sorry, you are involved from the government side and live your life through a variety of supply chain challenges and other aspects of delivering the goods for the people of Finland. How do you view this challenge on the minerals flows for your green energy transition here?
Well, it is a challenge. And first of all, thank you for having me here. It has been a very interesting time, and first of all, also welcome to Helsinki, everybody. It's good to meet people after all these quarantine years. I think that is one big time. In my daily work in the ministry, I'm looking circular economy from the economic side, and how to do sustainable business and maintain the competitiveness of our industry in these quite stormy times. Although the pandemic fading, troubled times are not yet over. And if I reflect to what Ashley said, I think that systemic thinking and services are something that we are looking forward. But do you want me to continue also?
Please do.
Yes.
Yes, you've got another few minutes,
Yes,
and love to hear more.
I think the energy revolution is needed, and it's ongoing. And this relax, reimagine, reapproach codes that we were discussing when preparing this session are extremely good selections. And we need a new way of thinking. And before relaxing, we need to identify a few issues and solve them. The energy revolution is ongoing in full speed, from energy production with solar, wind energy. In windmills also bioeconomy solutions are possible to be combined, as well as in batteries. And now we are talking about the hydrogen economy. And that will revolutionize the energy production and the storage of energy, but also it works as a raw material in many circular economy processes. And it's very important for renewal of the high energy industry. These technologies contain several materials and components that contain multiple sensitivities in the global markets. Not to go even any deeper there, but we need to consider to use something else, because the volumes of the materials needed in this energy revolution are insane. I guess quite many of you have already seen the studies about it, and the link between the materials and energy systems is deepening, and we are in trying to find the solutions. But the cheap energy is not the only target we have. Also, energy consumption must be considered. So how we do the same with the less energy? And it must be addressed in the global level. Also the efficiency. Recycling is not the only full answer. So we need to also better understand where the raw materials are, when they are available, and how they are available. This same goes with all the materials in the circular economy, not just minerals. Also, Critical Raw Material Act here in Europe, European Union is taking this seriously. To make that information useful, we need totally new level of digitalization and huge amount of data that must be turned to the information. And I think the digitalization is the key of the circular economy. We need that, but also at the same time it creates a huge burden also for this electric mineral demand. We have all kind of reporting obligations for the environmental regulation and permitting, and more is coming with the European Green Deal actions. We should take care that all these systems are secure, reliable, traceable, and especially the data systems are talking to each other so that they are interoperable, so that circular economy is needing the digital systems and this connection between the data, but we need the whole digital system revolution with us, so we can be utilizing whatever they can create, but maybe we are not the only one solving the problem. And also technical breakthroughs are needed to avoid the worst sensitivities and barriers in material availability. Magnets are one of hot topics at the moment, and we need those in energy conversion in almost every equipment. That is also addressed in the European Critical Raw Material Act. Can we avoid using these critical materials? Maybe, but changing the technologies takes time. And recently, these economical disturbances in the logistics chains have pushed this forward quite nicely. The renewal of technologies are good pace, taking into account security of supply. So security is a new word that we need to add on this also. The other needed resources is money. So it is not only production of sustainable energy as efficiently as possible, but also the demand side needs to be addressed. So if the industry is in the revolution, they need cheap energy, yes, but the energy companies, so that they are willing to invest, they need also customers. And new investments in the industrial sector are needed also, but they are competing from the same minerals. So we need to be very careful here how to run this show. We need to reimagine the whole big picture, not to go from partial optimization, but to see the big picture. These industrial developments may compete about the same mineral resources, and then we are creating roadblocks to us. So what we have done in Finland, okay, we have got some quite good news from the investments recently, and more hopefully coming today. The working atmosphere is quite positive at the moment, and the sustainable goals from the governmental side has been quite high. So that gives the operating environment quite nice. Clean energy is available, and it has been attracting these investments. One of the inspirational solutions I'm working with is related to the circular economy of mining industry. Mm-hmm. In Finland, we create about 3 million tons of household waste, 50 million tons of industrial waste, and 90 million tons of mining waste. So we are looking on those. And we have a coordination group working on it, and hopefully we have some good results this autumn. But the idea is to increase the added value close to the origin of the site and make it more profitable to transport. We need free thinking, and mining companies have been very positive on that. And for other Finnish solutions, please visit the expo. We have the booth there at the booth number 45 if you look from your maps. Thank you.
Thank you. It clearly outlines the big role for the public sector and a whole range of sort of industrial coordination, demand questions, using the taxation, and then helping to send consistent signals on national priorities, which link to land use and recovery.
Yeah.
So it's an important example, and I think we certainly, speaking from a Canadian perspective, have a lot to learn from that more integrated approach. So Anna, can you speak to us on your particular entry point into the challenges associated with the green energy transition mineral supply?
Okay, thank you so much, first of all, Helsinki, for hosting us. I was very amazed. I'm from Kyiv. Kyiv used to be the greenest city once, but now I discovered the greenest city probably in whole Europe, and I was fascinated by the city which is sinking in their gardens, which is just amazing and inspiring. So that's one of the takeaways in these short hours. Now back to the green economy. So that's probably a good branding story from Helsinki, which we can adapt here and think how we can turn cities into the green hubs, be it cities, be it industrial cities, be it industrial clusters, be it anything, how we can create green as a service or sustainability as a service. That's my key point and takeaway I would like you all to think about. At any level, be it government, be it public sector, be it community level, municipality, particular corporation, startup level, or private sector at all. Personally, I was lucky and grateful to be involved at different levels and mix of those sometimes. Trying to resolve the supply chains which are right now seeing a major shift and interference and probably revolution instead of evolution. I look at this perspective which I mentioned as green hubs or regenerative hubs or sustainable hubs. Those words are complementary and in the same time are interchangeable. And there is proven, thankfully, statistics. There's Eurostat, and then there's other meaningful and respected resources which prove that clusters or hubs or those collaborations deliver much better impacts. And in total, that can be a net positive impact. That should become our common metric based on the common goals, based on the commons, since we share one planet. The dark side, which I haven't mentioned, and we don't like to look sometimes at that, the total cost over exploitation of our Earth, and metals is not exclusion. In fact, metals are one of the biggest ones, or minerals, is there is a number for that. It's 44 trillion, which is 50% of current GDP. And so there's economic number for that, there's financial number, there's investment number for that. And in more human terms, we need to replenish by 2050, but in more realistic terms, we can see already a lot of cost associated already with migration, with droughts, with fires, with everything. Last year, Europe faced unprecedented challenges with droughts, which affected directly energy security. So we don't even whilst we were talking about the mineral security, something else has hit us hard. So we're talking here about the systemic approach, which we hopefully can address via those collaborative models, which we can put in the hubs or clusters perspective, which is a very, very old concept, probably as old as our Earth. And efficiencies and effectiveness, so we're addressing here both upside and downside. So triple bottom line. So upsides here, or value add perspective, true value, not just value, is roughly around the 20% around those clusters. We speak here about different elements of resource efficiency, be it decarbonization, be it water efficiency via circular models, or a healthy energy mix, or of course other elements which contribute to that. In terms of the bottom line, we're of course talking here about the operational efficiencies and margins, operational margins, without which any single corporation will not start the conversation, or will start but will pause it somewhere in the middle. So those also can be optimized up to 20%. But as we can see, there's a limit. So how we can overachieve that limit? So instead of this, we have in this limit, we can have a sky as a limit. The research has been done, and the sustainable The sustainable business opportunities were valued at the 10 trillion a year. So coming back to the dark side, which is 44 trillion of 50% of GDP, we can quickly overcome if we really cooperate in 4 years, which is quite an interesting number, 4.5 to be more precise. So how do we do it? Be it that we barely can agree on how much we water use or how much we use minerals, and how we basically detangle ourselves from Chinese codependency or rebuild our value chains after Russian invasion, it's a big question mark. Probably there's no silver bullet. It's a step-by-step process, building regional hubs and those distributed connected hubs based on the bottom-up and also top-down approach, as Minister today mentioned at the British Embassy reception, is the way forward. And one of such hubs, for instance, we're looking at cross-sectoral collaboration with a specific theme dedicated for aerospace industry or for other industries, which will incorporate, first of all, criteria of mineral security, water security, and of course, energy security and food securities. Those 4 aspects without which interconnected resource security, we cannot move forward. If we don't move forward without the security, of course, we will face insecurities which quite often lead to their conflicts. Sometimes those violent conflicts, sometimes are those social unrest. So to avoid that, we're talking about security. This is where we agree. And then the next point is interesting part is how to achieve that is industrial symbiosis, which actually came from Europe as well, this definition, and very, very old model as well. It's a cross-sectoral approach, and there are several successful examples been running over 20 years, in some cases even more in Europe. So we can just elaborate on that model and explore that model and, of course, adapt that model. It's a great combination where we can see how pharmaceutical company successfully works with a waste management company, how successfully works with the energy companies, and how successfully works with the chemical companies. And then they not only recycle the products, but they also upcycle the products, and there is literally zero waste within those clusters. So what are the preconditions for those? Of course, successful, sustainable planning. If their logistics supply chain is far, no one will be transporting that. The economics don't make sense. Then, of course, within the CO2, another type of pollution also doesn't make sense. So we're coming back to the design and sustainable planning with in mind now their boundaries of Earth, and basically we need to look into the impact-driven outcomes, which we put in a front end. Not the input-output outcome model, but actually we put impact all the way through in the theory of change. And then we go into the other hands. So outcomes becoming not a challenge, outcome simply becomes a natural outcome like in nature. And that's what we're looking at, and we're facing right now. We decided to take up on challenge not just in renewable energy, but in renewable energy, and also one of the most critical and strategic resources for global security. And that's quite interesting, because we can see that real challenge is not just in the resource management, but in the cultural management. And cultural management, this is so when we say that security means the same definition for each of us here. For Helsinki, for Kiev, or Riyadh, for other countries across the world. And so we come out with the common goals, common indicators, common metrics, and they're progressive, they don't need to be stale. So we agree also to disagree, which is very, very important.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, it really puts the full range of risks and potential benefits on the table, and I think underscores the urgency of action and transformative action. There are models to learn from other sectors, and there are very practical business steps for collaboration, which currently are missing in most cases for the mining sector, and it's something, a challenge that we all can take away with us to see what, when we come back here next year, what we have done differently. So on that theme, we've got about 10 minutes left, and for this panel before we go into our second panel. So we've always felt that one of the strengths of the World Circular Economy Forum is that it is action-oriented. It's a great place to understand, a great place to network, but it's also a great place to plot action. And we're all very dedicated to seeing our worlds change in real time. So the challenge I would ask each of you to briefly address is, what are the priorities for you in your areas of influence? What are you going to do over the next 2 to 3 years as a priority action that will enable acceleration of progress? I know that's a question you could spend an hour on, but we'll give you a few minutes just to think about what really rises to the top on things you've got to do when you get home.
I think for me, it probably hasn't been brought up enough yet, which is we need a mindset shift. I think it's fair to say we've only all ever lived in this linear economy, and coupled with that, the way our organizations are structured. Again, Janez Počnik brought this up this morning, which was governance. Not only have we lived only in this dominant economy, the organizations in which we work as employees or we lead are also structured in silos. They are not set up to have a systemic model integrated. So I think, one, we need to work on what are the shifts in the way we think, what are the things, the tools that we have then to start thinking about the integration and connection of circularity in our organizations, which is going to put some pretty big questions on the table around how we structure governance and what are the mechanisms that we can support, inside organizations to accelerate circularity. So for me and the company that I lead and the incredible women that I work alongside and all of our clients that give us the incredible opportunity to work with them, it's about mindset shift. It's empowering them with the suite of tools that the circular economy offers, spanning governance models and technology, but it's also about asking the pretty fundamental questions, right from the board and the shareholding all the way through to people that are operating at those assets. We do need alignment in culture, and we do need alignment in the vision that we all collectively want to work towards. And I believe circular economy can be that vision, but we need to start, really creating that culture around it.
Thanks. I think one of my phrases that rings in my head pretty much every day is that culture eats strategy for breakfast every morning. If you don't fix your culture, your strategies will fail. So I think that's a well placed. Doesn't mean you don't have solid strategies that you need, but if they're not set into a culture shift and a culture mindset for circularity, they will fall short. I think that's a great point. Sari, your thoughts on actions for the coming year that you want to prioritize to make sure you're moving the dial?
Well, the priorities of the ministry, I think we have 3 tools: regulation, funding, and information. Those are the tools that we have. And we are now looking forward to the new government, what kind of program we will have in, I hope, few weeks' time. But the role of the government is then, of course, provide predictable regulative environment, also taking care of that the circular economy is in the heart of the economical policy that we make. Also, the incentives for innovative operating environment. There's funding available at the moment from EU Recovery Fund, but what after that is the big question mark for us. And then we need to ensure basic education and availability of needed resources. That's also one task of the government, to make sure that we have skillful people coming up to work with the circular economy. And then we, of course, need to develop and support new business models, because circular economy is changing the value chain and making it to network. Do we understand well enough what kind of changes are needed? Are the banks and other financial instruments ready to adopt the new models, how to work? Because if we are going to the new type of life when we are sharing more and lending more and so on, what is the incentive for the bank to participate? Mm-hmm. What are the money-making systems in the circular economy? Or how do you benefit from the well-being of people if that is better. So the instruments are totally different, and we need to understand those. And most of all, nobody can do the circular economy alone. We need new type of networks and collaboration. We need public, private, and whatsoever networks. So it is not PPP anymore. It's new ways of working and connecting.
Thank you. That's a good list I can see developing here. And Anna, the last word on this panel to you in terms of what you want to spend your time on, what you feel you need to spend your time on in the next couple of years to really move these issues forward in a way that'll have lasting impact.
I'll continue what I've been doing.
Yeah.
So it's creating a common adventure for all of us, because this is a challenging journey and it has to be fun. And I can speak on behalf of a lot of people, including my people. We suffered a lot, and I think we need to change our suffering mentality to prosperity mentality. It's from surviving to thriving, and it's not going to happen overnight, but I think it's possible. And once that happens, then we're going to start seeing more opportunities and shifts from their risk management to their net positive impact creation mentality. And that's how we're going to do it. It's through their advanced management. So to be more specific, what we look at their asset management creation, this new PPP type of facility, which will de-risk assets, create new investment opportunities, which we're very excited, in advanced material space, which will hopefully help to create our little drop in this big ocean of challenges, where we can shift paradigm thinking from primary resources to all sort of but primary resources, and close those loops and deliver opportunities via cross-sectoral collaboration.
Thank you. Great. Well, I'd like to thank all three of you for really doing a remarkable job in a short period of time of laying out both the challenges and sort of priorities and opportunities. There's a lot of work to do, and I hope many of you in this room will join us as we try and develop a greater sort of national and international collaboration to make some of these good ideas come to life. So thank you. I'm going to ask our next three panelists to come to the stage, and we have, again, an additional diversity of voices, practitioners who are helping in a variety of different ways on the mine sites, in the finances and financing world, as well as in the research, policy, development world. So there's as we all know, this is an integrated problem with integrated solutions being the only way forward. Please come forward. And so what we're able to do here, I think, is illustrate some of those dimensions, all of which need to be woven together to into a coordinated strategy. So I'm very pleased to welcome the next three panelists up. We have Ben Santos James, who's a management consultant working on sustainable finance, climate tech. You've got experience in renewables investing and circularity as a core piece, and also dedicates time to being youth representative with the UN. We talk more about that. Patience, many of you would have seen in the opening show. Patience and I also met in Riyadh, and it was evident from the first moment I heard her talk that we had to tap more into her experience and insight. So I'm really glad to have you back here. For those of you who might not have been here, Patience is the CEO of Insight Mining Expertise, which is focused on developing strategies for critical minerals and circularity to address these sort of green energy mineral supply. And finally, a guy I've done a lot of work with, Jeff McCarney. He is the research director for the Smart Prosperity Institute, which is one of Canada's leading think tanks working on policy, sustainable policy, and prosperity analysis, of which there is a distinct and growing component around circularity and in the Canadian context. So similar to our last panel, we're looking at the different areas of influence that each of you have, the kinds of things that you're seeing as the strategic priorities to really bring together or move along to ensure that this green energy transition is not involving either unresponsibly sourced minerals, so we can't draw down on planetary boundaries while solving for climate solutions on green energy, and that in fact we have the resources we need, especially in the geopolitically challenged environment we have to carry forward at pace. So I'm just going to ask each of them in a similar format to speak for 5 to 7 minutes about what they see as challenges and primarily with a focus on strategic priorities for action. There's a lot going on out there, but if we don't sequence and focus, we will fail to achieve the accelerated progress we need. So, Patience, I think with your broader international experience and throughout supply chains, maybe you could start us off.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alan, for this opportunity. Firstly, let me just introduce you to what we actually do. So inside Mining Experts, we help mining companies to reach their sustainability development goals and also to help them to implement circular economy business models, which is really quite challenging for most mining companies at this point in time. Then, in addition to that, we also provide insights into the critical minerals, right? So we just focus on the critical minerals, supply, demand, on the pricing, but also in terms of where and how mining companies should actually compete and what are other opportunities, especially in terms of technology, substitution, recycling, and so forth and so forth. We are also building a platform to bring together think tankers, innovators, and to solve some of these sustainability and circularity issues for the mining industry. You can go to my website and you'll be able to sign up as an expert, or you want to participate and help mining companies to be more circular on the website. Then in terms of the challenges that we're currently facing, I think I spoke a bit in terms of the mining industry and some of the challenges that they're facing. But one of the things that we have to think about is in terms of supply security. We know that with the decarbonization journey, we will need more critical minerals. Is it sufficient what we currently have? And I'm speaking both from the current operations, big mining companies, the pipeline of projects that are coming up, and then obviously in terms of exploration activity. I know there's quite a lot of work that's being done. For example, BHP is actually funding some of these junior explorers to fast track because, as you know, the mining industry, it's a long lead time industry. It can take up to about 5 to 10 years from the time that you put in the capital to the time that you get your first ton of copper or ounce of platinum. So in terms of the getting that supply, we may actually have a gap. We may have a gap of supply, and that's a huge risk in terms of us achieving our decarbonization goals. And therefore, what does it mean? I think I spoke briefly this morning about the recycling. There is an opportunity for the recycling, which is really on the circular business model, for us to be able to fill in that gap, right? Because by the time you sink in your shaft to be able to get your copper or your nickel, people are not going to be able to have enough to get their cell phones from lithium, to get their, from vehicles, electric vehicles, which a lot of countries are talking about their goals to have electric vehicles at a certain date. That's not going to happen. So that's one of the challenges, and I believe that we need to be able to look at alternatives, we need to be more efficient, we need to re-look at the business model, particularly in the mining industry. My second point talks to the uses also of these critical minerals. Let's talk about the energy system. But before I speak about the energy systems, I just want to draw your attention to data, right? I'm still a scientist, by the way. So what are we trying to solve? We're talking of 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases that we're trying to take out. right, so that we reduce the global warming. What constitutes the 50 billion? I'm not going to be very, very, in terms of the numbers, to be really straight, have the exact numbers. But roughly, manufacturing, which is essentially manufacturing cement, steel, including all these solar panels, the wind turbines, it constitutes almost about between 40 to 50% in terms of the emission, right, when you manufacture this product. Then we talk about agriculture, potentially maybe another 20%. You talk about transportation, which is essentially the vehicles, right? What we actually emit when we drive those cars, which are on gasoline and all that. That's probably another 20%. Then we talk of electricity generation. That's another 20 to 30%. So if you think about it, if we're trying to solve the issue of greenhouse gases, shouldn't we also put a lot of thought on the manufacturing? Shouldn't we put a lot of innovation in the manufacturing? Because it constitutes quite a lot. So my point is, innovation is at the key of what we're trying to solve. And especially if we're to manufacture all these solar panels, right, to get renewable energies, should we have probably even smaller solar panels? If we can be clever and more innovative, I always draw parallels where we used to have a TV that was really huge and it was taking a lot of glass, but now very small. Think about even the cell phones. We used to have huge cell phones, the Nokias, and now we've got very small Nokias. So it's about being more efficient, but also being clever in our innovation strategies, both at a global level, which is countries investing in R&D, so we can reduce the amount that we need, because we're not going to have enough critical minerals. It's not going to be enough. And that way we'll be able to solve the problem of supply deficit if we are not able to mine fast enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that was also reflected in some of the comments this morning, is that we have to be thinking not only on how to be more efficient, how to be sufficient, but how to do that in a way that reflects real boundaries and not just to become better at what we do now. That will be the death of us. So I think that's a great way of capturing what you said, is a great way of capturing some of those challenges within the sector, which is often being challenged to become just more effective miners. Well, let's think about the problem in a very, very different way. And I want to come back to some discussions we had about the role mining can play as active parts of different supply chains, but let's come back to that. Jeff, your thoughts on how these fit together with your lens of a researcher, policy maker, and analysts on circularity.
Perfect. Thanks, Alan. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I really much echo the thoughts on the need for smart strategic approaches to innovation along key supply chains. It's a really important part, and things we've heard earlier today as well about the need for new business models, innovation in business systems, thinking about metals as a service. It's all really important. At the Smart Prosperity Institute, we're Canada's largest environment economy research network and think tank, and so we've come at it as researchers. We engage with researchers across Canada and internationally to think about smart environment economy policy that we can adopt and move forward in Canada. And so trying to take a step back, maybe think about this from the broader perspective that we try to communicate in our policy work and as researchers. It's hard not to be a bit repetitive at this point. We've heard a lot, but sort of framing the way we approach it is the hard part of circular economy is we need to think about business innovation, we need to think about product innovation, we need to think along value chains, but it's also a systems problem. If we back up and think about it as a complex system, and you're looking at it within the context of the triple global challenges, the triple global crisis we're operating within, I tend to look at this in the policy work we do as you're almost in a three-way race. And the first part of that race is you're trying to move forward on decarbonization technologies and decarbonized energy systems as fast as possible to meet our net zero and our climate change goals. And this requires renewable energy technologies, but they are material intensive. And so the first thing we need to think about is design and innovation in those systems to reduce the material intensity, use more circular materials and products, innovate towards different systems, smaller technologies, less material intensive, and push that envelope as fast as we can without sacrificing speed and adoption of the renewable energy itself, because we have to move that ahead. We can't wait for the ideal technology. We have to keep moving if we're going to meet our climate goals, and that's essential. The second part of that race then is whatever technologies we're adopting at a given point in time and putting in place from a decarbonization perspective and from the energy system, is we have to think about this, smart material solutions within those and advancing work in circular approaches and circular business models and systems so that we're working with the most sustainable versions of those materials possible, that we're reducing the impact of the processing, the manufacturing, the shipping right along the value chain, right to end of life, to recovery, reprocessing, remanufacturing, recycling, and innovating along that value chain so that we are reducing the primary material demand as much as possible to meet the decarbonization technologies require. And those two are going to act. The third part of that race then is, even in a best case scenario, leading research suggests that we can probably meet 10 to 20, maybe 20% of the material demand for decarbonization technologies with secondary material sources if we really ramp up our secondary material performance over the coming 20 to 30 years. So there's a core gap that we're going to have to meet with raw material extraction. And so how are we thinking about the resource governance that overlaps that and making sure that where we are looking for those new raw materials that we're going to need if we're going to hit the decarbonization objective, that we're doing it in a responsible, sustainable way and not sacrificing not only maintaining but advancing work on what it means to be a sustainable, responsible global resource producer. And thinking about that from the perspective not only of where you're demanding the new energy technologies, but right upstream along the value chain to the 80 countries globally, primarily in the global south, who are where we produce and extract those resources from and what it means for livelihoods in those countries. And so you've got this sort of three-way race, and the faster you go on one, the less pressure you have on another one, but we've got to push them all at the same time. And it really matters how we do this, and we're seeing real investments starting to be put in place now that are going to shape that race, right? From a North American perspective, we're looking at the U.S. where they have their Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, billions and hundreds of billions of dollars being vested along things like battery supply chains, from processing to manufacturing to recycling, to build up that capacity. But that's baking in a demand for critical materials that we're going to have to meet. And if we see where those investment dollars are going, reports from places like Bloomberg are highlighting that we already have excess capacity for battery recycling that we're not going to be able to meet until 2030. So we're getting ahead on the recycling part, maybe not far enough ahead on the other aspects of that race. And then you look, for a place like Canada, we're trying to keep up, and we're investing tens of billions of dollars in supporting gigafactories from Volkswagen to make sure we have a place in the auto sector. And thinking about what investments then we're going to need to have a responsible processing of metals in between raw material extraction and their use in those factories, and so that we're doing that in a sustainable way. And then what investments are we going to need for end-of-life material management recovery that those factories are going to produce, and they're getting baked in. Some of our work suggests if you look at wind and solar, we're going approximately 30 to 60 times material end-of-life materials from wind and solar going forward to 2050 than we currently generate now. We need to be able to handle those in a smart way. And then getting to the resource governance side, Patience made a similar point. From a Canadian viewpoint, it takes on average about 15 years right now to approve a new mine. And our Minister of Natural Resources is on record in saying they want to have that by about 4 to 5 years, so approximately a quarter, which is ambitious. But if we're still talking 10 years to get a new mine, we have to really think seriously about the amount of pressure that's going to be put to compromise some of these responsible and ethical sourcing standards to meet the material demands that are coming down the pipe. And I think how we manage that pressure is going to tell a lot about whether we are successful in advancing what a circular, decarbonized energy system looks like. And so it's being then realistic about how far we can go with designing down materials demand as much as possible, circular solutions along the way, responsible resource governance. There's likely to be a gap in demand there that we can't meet in a sustainable, responsible way, and being honest up front about that and thinking about where we need additional policies for the energy system, incentivize new processes that reduce overall energy demand that we just can't meet responsibly. So that's sort of how we overall think about the problem, the different aspects that we're trying to address.
Yeah, it's a great summary of those dimensions and those sort of parallel imperatives, none of which we can afford to decouple in any way, shape, or form. And certainly this lived experience in Canada that we have is as a mining nation, but as a nation that also has a very significant Indigenous population and a whole new set of patterns that we need to work at a governance level to ensure that that these things are brought forward together, because the social and political aspects of these things we're starting to see play out in resistance throughout North America and elsewhere in the world on the resistance to the exploitation of, say, lithium resources. I could use as one, but that's just one of many, as well as the reliance on cobalt and others. So there, the socio-political dimension of it, and managing for that potential conflict through other kinds of investments is going to be a really critical part of that whole piece. So that's thanks. Absolutely. And for you, what are you seeing both with, say, your finance lens and as somebody who's inheriting this lovely mess we've created? What's on your mind when you're thinking on strategic priorities?
It does raise the question, right, of who's going to clean up this mess.
Yes.
So I think I want to zoom out a bit and think about what are the strategic priorities for the energy transition and then how that informs circularity policy when it comes to metals. So the energy transition is not just about sustainability. We all know it's about net zero. Sure, we need to reduce emissions, we need to bring that down. But it's also about access to affordable energy, to, in particular, millions of people in the global south who are without reliable energy access and will require significant material demands to be able to deliver that access over the coming years. And it's also about security. It's reducing dependency, particularly for Europe, on foreign imports of oil and gas, and moving towards a system where we are more self-sufficient and less dependent. But we risk, by carrying on with the same status quo, getting into a situation where we're jumping from one dependency of oil and gas and imported oil and gas imports to another. And that's why things like this, and more broadly the European Union's approach to developing a circular metal economy, is incredibly important. And with that in mind, under these high-level strategic priorities, I think there are a few things that one must consider. The first is around how do we foster innovation systems. So that's from the community scale upwards. So at the community level, how do you work to be able to aggregate demand? How do you work to get people together for take-back obligations? And then that goes all the way up to national strategy and putting in place a circular economy roadmap that works together with national climate plans and actually with the modelling as well. The second is around equity. And I think this offers us a real opportunity to do things differently. Metal supply chains aren't that different, really, to most industrial production supply chains. We have an opportunity to reimagine how we share economic benefits, nationally and transnationally. The circular economy offers the potential to reduce industrial decline, potentially even reverse that, and provide economic opportunity by focusing on areas that perhaps had different challenges, as we've seen Europe's industrial heartland struggle. And in this place, we aren't beholden to where the mines are located. We can actually distribute those benefits and be able to restore and regenerate areas. And that's really quite exciting. And then the third point that I wanted to touch upon around high-level priorities is that we need to think about how we do better in terms of the choices that we make, whether we go towards a more decentralized energy system, potentially that requires less copper for transmission infrastructure, whether we look at alternatives to permanent magnets in offshore wind, whether we look at less lithium-intensive batteries and electric vehicles. There are a number of choices, a number of technology choices that ultimately will be informed in policy and ultimately need to be reflected in national planning. Now, financing, of course, still provides a big barrier here, and the reality is, as some of the other panelists have touched upon, the cost of capital is a big problem. project finance access is difficult, but there are benefits. There are various surveys, various pieces of research out there showing us a 1% to 2% premium for ESG-related finance, and that is expected to, in terms of rate of return, and that's expected to be reflected in circular economy as well. But there are things that we can look at to reduce risk here. We can provide offtake agreements, so that can be by governments, potentially in some cases, providing guaranteed offtake agreements for circular metals, but it can also be banks potentially looking at trading physical metals if they're allowed to do that, or it can be original equipment manufacturers using those recyclers and bringing them directly into their supply chain. That's quite exciting. Secondly, we've also got this asset as a service type model that some of the other panelists have touched upon. I won't go into that in too much detail. I'm sure you'll hear far more about that over the coming 2 days as well. But thirdly, something that I haven't heard much about at the forum so far is around insetting and the ability to be able to reduce emissions in your own value chain, adhere to voluntary targets such as SBTI, and be able to reduce your emissions through circular economy initiatives without having to resort to offsets in the traditional sense. And that's quite exciting. So there are opportunities to make finance more attractive, but it's ultimately a significant challenge. Now, the final point I wanted to touch upon was around young people. And I do a lot of work with Youngo, which is the youth constituency to the UNFCCC. And what we see is that young people are very much engaged with this in a policy space. They're much less engaged from a private sector and business space. And that's why something like this is fantastic, because it brings together the best and the brightest from business, from policy, from civil society to be able to talk and collaborate. But ultimately, if we're going to make systemic change, we need to raise a generation of young people who will go on to become future leaders in business and in politics, who will, when the laptops in their office come to the end of their life, they will say to their employees, hey, put them in this center and we will recycle them. We will take that back and we will be responsible, and we will be responsible leaders. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to go away from move away from this idea of intent and ambition, and more towards action and implementation. And we do that through literacy, and we do that through participation, and we do that through getting young people involved.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that gives me some hope and some challenges all in the same place. And I think somebody was reflecting earlier today about the fact that many of us have been steeped, our bones are built of the linear economy, and the ways we've grown up professionally and personally are kind of hardwired into that. And we have an opportunity for a generational change by bringing in these kinds of analyses and opportunities such as this, but what comes out of this to really build that new wired generation that's able to take some of these transformations forward. I personally gain a lot of hope as somebody who's worked in and around the mining industry for 30 years. I'm fond of saying these days, I've never been more excited and more frightened about the future, and I hold those equally, and am committed to not flinching from either. So in the about 10 minutes we have left, there is that says 5 minutes, but it's actually 2:34. So we'll use our max. I want to just hear from you that same question. This has been really helpful in understanding the nature of the problems and the sort of diverse and integrated ways in which they could be addressed. For you in your own professional and personal lives, but particularly with your professional areas of influence, what do you want to spend your time on in sort of strategic sequence over the next couple of years to make sure that happens so other things can happen? So maybe I'll start with you, Patience.
Okay, thank you. I think for me, I'll just build on what Ben has already mentioned, which is really fantastic. I think collaboration is really key, and I'll give an example, particularly with the mining sector, in terms of historically, the business model has always been we just mine, we just smelt, refine, and then the metal goes, and that's it. So we get our returns, and that's it. But we need to break those silos. And what I mean by that is we need collaboration, the mining companies with the fabricators. I know there are some industries that are, well, some commodities or companies that are already doing that. And it's so important, I think, even when you think about geopolitics, right? Australia is one of the superpowers in terms of most of the critical minerals, but they don't beneficiate that much downstream, right? And I think globally, China beneficiates more than 80% of all the critical minerals, because all the batteries that we see, solar panels, actually happens in China. We need to diversify that to also de-risk. We know geopolitics is there. So it's so important to also diversify even as nations in terms of beneficiating rather than just mining. So that's one. And that can also happen through collaborative efforts between government and mining companies and also suppliers themselves. Mining companies can also further beneficiate. And what stops them from owning the value chain, right? We are seeing also some of these auto companies putting in a lot of capital or funding some of these mining projects, and then they sign an off-take agreement to secure supply of these critical minerals. I mean, I've read quite a lot of auto manufacturers doing that recently, especially with lithium and cobalt. They are signing up agreements with mining companies. So I think if we can break the silos and get all mining companies working with the fabricators and creating the sustainable, secular business models, I think that will actually be more sustainable. The second part is, in addition to embracing, I think, circularity, mining companies can also explore alternatives and substitutions for critical minerals. We have the periodic table, and I will give you an example, which is the platinum group metals, where previously, probably the last 100 years, palladium was the one which was used in the autocatalyst to reduce the emissions, because PGMs are mostly used to reduce emissions. But because of geopolitics, eventually palladium price just skyrocketed, and there was a huge supply gap, because Russia is the major producer of palladium. Now, a lot of research and development went into what are other substitutions that we can put instead of palladium, and platinum then became the substitute, right? So the question is, can we substitute, for example, cobalt batteries with something else? Same again, even with some of these renewable energy systems like solar panels. Can we be able to thrift, which is reducing the amount of critical minerals that we have? All right. The last part is, I think I've mentioned, is investing in research and development or partnering with innovative startups can actually foster the creation of alternative materials, and technology is actually the key, because we can alleviate some of the supply chain constraints that we have seen. And then to conclude, I think it's important that we have a fully transformed secular mining industry, and we would need to actually prioritize innovation and of course the utilization of renewable energy, but I think most importantly, efficient use of the existing infrastructure, right? Reusing that and ensuring that we redesign a new industrial system that will be regenerative. Thank you.
Thank you, Patience. In a couple of minutes each, to bring us in, Jeff, do you want to give us your sense of your priorities at Smart Prosperity and the top things on your mind and you need to achieve next?
Sure, thank you, Alan. So I was going to raise three things. I'll try to maybe condense one of them down so that we get two. But I think the core to moving ahead is realizing that with the decarbonization challenge, we have to move fast to get renewable energy technologies in place. That's going to create, as mentioned earlier, a critical materials challenge, and it means we're getting ahead of the innovation curve on circularity a bit. And so I think there's, information therefore is going to be key, right? Understanding and creating the discussions and the partnerships and the collaborations so that we have an evolving understanding of what circularity means in practice, or where we think sort of the frontier of what we are able to do at a particular given time as we have a dynamic and evolving innovation sphere in technology sphere moving alongside of our renewable energy technology adoption. And so we need collaboration, ongoing discussion to clarify what do we mean by circularity. What does it look like in practice? What is acceptable, best in field adoption technology right now, so that we can both hold companies accountable, but also move the practice ahead over time, so we're not just sticking with current practices, but advancing circularity over time. Alongside that, I think we need work to understand and track and trace clusters of new technology adoption and evolution, working in different sectors in sort of a market and region level, to understand where technology adoption possibilities are going, and track those and make sure they align with the transparency and certification and different standards that are being adopted to ensure that we are communicating sustainable practices along value chains, and that those keep up with each other. And then the last thing I think is really important, and that we've been learning through our approach and increasingly trying to adopt, is we need to listen. Particularly along the resource governance side, and particularly when working with communities. You can't just assume that the discussion that we would have around what a circular economy looks like in this venue automatically means we understand what it means for an Indigenous community in Northern Canada whose land is on the mine sites that we're talking about trying to develop. It doesn't mean that we understand what it means for local communities in the Global South who, again, live in the areas on the mine sites that we're trying to develop. And we need to listen to what their understanding and their values are, their approaches to circularity, what it means for them and their communities, what it means for their livelihoods, and what it means for their integration into a global circular economy vision. And that listening part is really important.
Great, thank you. And last word to you, Ben.
Thank you very much. Echoing the thoughts from my fellow panelists very much there. I think I want to touch upon the youth aspect a bit more, and obviously there's a panel coming later on this. But for me, when I look at youth engagement with circular economy and looking at metals in the energy transition supply chain specifically, I see it as a three-step process. The first is that we need to build a network, we need to build a coalition, we need to build collaboration. Ultimately, we want to get to a point where we have actors broad and deep across the value chain who are working towards a shared purpose, a shared vision for what the energy transition should look like, and a better vision, really, for society. Once we have that, once we bring together civil society, we bring together business, we bring together policymakers, we then need to focus around literacy and capacity building. And I often get asked the question, both when it comes to circular economy, but more broadly for climate change, from other young people, how can you get involved? And the first thing that I generally say is start by being informed. Start by going to these resources, and I'm sure those of you here will see this and will have many resources that come to mind. Share those with young people who are interested. Empower them to get involved and get active within the space, because ultimately we need to build capacity for the next generation who will be, per my phrasing earlier, responsible for cleaning up the mess. And then the third thing is, once you have that capacity, you need to get young people into a position where they are directly influencing policy and governance. And when I use the word policy, I say that in both the government sense, the public sector sense, but also the private sector sense as well. And only then can, I think, we really achieve transformation. But that's the hope, that's the vision, and hopefully through this conference we'll lay a bit of the groundwork to get there.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks all of you for the distance you've traveled to get here and the insights that you've provided us. It's been, I've continued to learn a lot and be inspired by these insights and by the energy that goes behind them and the work you're doing when you're not here talking about it. I would encourage you to stick around for the next session, which is going to take a deeper dive on mining related and extractive related challenges. And then I'll put a plug in for our accelerator session on Thursday, June 1st, between 3 and 5, followed by a reception, which will be a much more participatory piece. It'll be a few panelists, but really breakout sessions, really looking at trying to develop strategies for collaboration going forward, taking some of these ideas and working with you as practitioners to see what we can do to carry the momentum forward to the future. So if you want more information about that, contact me or any of the panelists that can help you with that, but contact me and we'll hopefully see you and talk to you throughout the forum. Thanks very much.